My name is James Hackney, and I am the Dean of the School of Law at Northeastern. Today's event, subsequent events, and the associated pop-up courses are sponsored by the Presidential Council on Diversity and Inclusion at Northeastern that Dean Uta Poiger and I co-chair. They build on a tradition of collaboration between student affairs and academic units that we seek to foster. Before I say a few words of welcome, it is my pleasure to turn the mic over to Northeastern University's Provost, David Madigan.
Thank you very much, James. And let me just at the outset thank Tracy Robinson-Wood, Ellen Cushman, and Uta Poiger for making this happen, and also to the facilitators. Thank you very much. This is important work that you are about to engage in. I believe that the events of the past spring represent a turning point for our nation. I really hope this is true. I've been in this country long enough to know that there have been other moments of collective outrage, but this time feels different. Racism is endemic, and this cannot continue. The great universities have not been innocent bystanders in this story, but now I feel we have a responsibility to lead. And what's beginning here this evening and this semester is part of that leadership. If we cannot talk about racism, we simply will not make progress. But this is not easy, and I just commend you for leading this effort and for students for your participation. And I hope you have a very successful semester. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and welcome again to all of today's participants and viewers. As David mentioned, we will be grappling with issues of race and racism during this event series. Developing racial literacy is a process, one that refers to detecting, naming, opposing, and replacing racism. What we will be doing in these sessions is one example of such a process. We need such processes throughout the university and beyond. We also will need to see such processes as ongoing work. The series announcement makes a statement that I think is important. When we commit to speaking truthfully about race, we will experience vulnerability. If we can remain in this space, the potential for growth also exists. Our themes, which will be more fully explored in subsequent events, are history, culture, and policing and community. In reflecting on each, we will examine the intersectionality of race with gender, sexuality, class, and status. It is through these connections that the meaningful reflection and dialogue can flourish. Thanks to all our colleagues on today's and future panels for getting these university-wide conversations underway. To get us started with that dialogue, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Tracy Robinson-Wood, Professor of Applied Psychology in Bouvet College of Health Sciences. Tracy specializes in the intersection of race, gender, class, and culture, and psychosocial identity development. She holds an education master and education doctorate in human development from Harvard, and also serves as a licensed clinical mental health counselor. Tracy will give us an overview of the work of reflection, and then will moderate a conversation of the panelists and the audience. Dr. Robinson-Wood, the floor is yours.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Dean Hackney, for that lovely introduction. And welcome to each of you who is here. I am thrilled to be participating in this important work, and I thank you so much for your presence. In a moment on your screen, you will see all the speakers who will be participating tonight. And along with them, we will be discussing race, mining race, excavating race, from psychosocial narration. And we will think about and talk about thoughts and emotions and actions that allow us to do that work of speaking honestly to race and racism, to speaking about inclusion and respect for the different paths that have brought us here. Let us begin, and I begin with a story. Next slide, please. I was born and raised in Sacramento, California. My parents were children of the deep Jim Crow South and made their way to the West, where they met. One day, my mother said, "Tracy, you are going to have to run twice as fast to get half as far." "Why?" I asked. I was confused. "The world is not fair and will judge you by the color of your skin." My mother knew I had inherited a country that touted justice, but imposed an unfair melanin tax on my Black body. She also knew it was her duty to name racism, to equip me with tools to succeed. I knew she loved me fiercely and cared about me, my survival, and my success. Next slide. One day, I was talking to a friend of mine, a white woman, and I told her what my mother had said to me. She erupted into sobs. "What is wrong?" I asked. She replied, "What your mother said to you was harsh. You were a child. All of the Black women I know who are about my age, they received a similar message from their mothers," I said to her. I realized that my friend had not started the process of interrogating her whiteness and all of the privileges that come from her unexplored racial life. My friend critiqued my mother, but not the violence of racism that compelled my mother and legions of Black parents throughout time to name racism to their children while loving them with everything that they had to offer. Next slide, please. The ABCs. The A is for affect, feelings, how we feel, what we know we feel, and what we feel that we cannot and will not name. B is for behavior, actions, what we do and how we act, including those actions that injure ourselves and other people that we are aware of or are not aware of or will not admit to. And C is for cognition, thoughts, what we know we think and the thoughts that we are not aware of that we think. Next slide, please. My mother's ABCs. Thoughts are things, so I start with cognition. My mother's thoughts. My silence on racism harms my child. Racism exists and is wrong. I have a duty to name racism and use my knowledge to empower my child to push back against racism. Her behavior and actions. I speak to my child about racism. I told my child that racism existed, that it was unfair, that she had to work much harder as a Black girl. I told her she was great and would do great things, and I pray for her every day. Her feelings. I love and care for my child. I am very proud of her. I am sad and frustrated to have to tell her about the ugliness of racism. I am tired. Next slide. Racial literacy defined. Racial literacy refers to a set of practices designed by parents and others to teach their children how to recognize, name, challenge, and manage various forms of everyday racism. Dr. Franz Wendans Twine. The ability to read, recast, and resolve racially stressful social interactions. Dr. Howard Stevenson. Naming, seeing, opposing, and replacing racism. Dr. Jamie Ward. Next slide, please. My friend's ABCs. Her thoughts. Children should be spared the harshness of racism. To tell them of racism is mean. I am oblivious to and unaware of my privilege and how active it is. I am unaware of my white fragility and how active it is. I am unaware of my color blindness and how active it is in my life. Her behavior, I cried. I also denied the reality of racism. I toned police my friend's mother and used my tears as a weapon and as a defense. My friend's feelings. I felt pity for my friend. I was distressed, but by what I heard, I was distressed, and I'm entitled to my racialized comfort as a white woman. Next slide. The rain of racism falls on all the houses in the land. My house got wet. My friend's house got wet with the rain of racism. And each of your houses got wet, whether we know it or not. And acknowledging this truth begins the process of racial literacy. Next slide. Racial literacy is not hating white people. Racial literacy is not hating white skin. It is not hating light skin. Racial literacy is not racist. Next slide, please. Talking about race and racism is distressing, and it is liberating. White fragility is harsh for Black, Indigenous, people of color, for their lives and livelihood. White students, staff, and faculty need spaces to gather with other white people to interrogate their whiteness. When Black, Indigenous people of color call out white privilege and white supremacy, white people get very uncomfortable. Black, Indigenous people of color learn to tamp down white fragility. This work is anxiety producing and it is exhausting. Next slide, please. So a short list of cognitive barriers to racial literacy. My ancestors came from Europe with nothing. They worked hard, and that is what Black people need to do. White privilege. People are people. I don't see color. It's color blindness. It is hard to find qualified Blacks. White superiority, Black inferiority. Our department can't be racist. We have people of color and women. Tokenism. But which group has benefited mightily from affirmative action? White women. Next slide, please. Gender, ethnic, sexual, and geographic diversity are core to identity. They are core dimensions of identity, but they are not synonymous with race. They are safer conversations once racism is cut out, excised, ignored. Next slide, please. More cognitive barriers. I am a good person and have never been unkind to a Black person My last boyfriend was Black. Exceptionalism. Slavery ended long ago. Blacks should stop whining. Racism talk upsets me. Whites have been hurt by Blacks. White fragility. I'm sorry racism exists, but there is not much I can do to fix the problems that people of color keep having. White apathy. Next slide, please. White people won't change, and things just won't get better for Black people. People of color. Racial hopelessness and trauma, depression. Keep your head down and your mouth shut. Do normal white people things. Black, Indigenous, people of color, perpetuation of white fragility, assimilation. If I speak out against racism, I stand to lose. White silence. Next slide, please. Affective barriers to racial literacy. Fear guts racial literacy. What are we afraid of? Fear of our own and others' feelings, fear of anger, fear of betrayal, fear of defeat, demoralization, fear of embarrassment, rage, sadness, shame, resentment, violation, fear of being abandoned, of being called out, fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, fear of being pitied, rebuked, shamed, triggered, fear of Black power, fear of exploitation, being used to absolve others' guilty consciences, fear of loss, fear of losing insider status, fear of losing privilege, fear of losing a sense of power over people that we have always dominated, fear of looking bad, fear of offending others, of retaliation, fear of saying something wrong, fear of white fragility, fear of not being invited back to special events. Next slide, please. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced. James Baldwin. Racial literacy, detecting, naming, opposing, replacing racism. Detecting racism. It means recognizing where racism lurks, being conscious of how racism sounds and who are the friends of racism. Fear, sexism, xenophobia, transphobia, ableism, colorism, body shaming, contempt for the poor. I was poor. I rode the bus. I had free lunch. Naming racism, calling out racism, not being mute, shining the light on racism and how it is embedded through organizations, and understanding its impact on people and how people are impelled by it. Opposing racism through protest, writing, poetry, documentary, music, education, youth development strategies for coping, mobilizing, managing mental health, collaborating, building relationships with people across difference. Replacing racism, getting in good trouble. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Using power and privilege to dismantle racism, disrupting disparities with policies and practices that evidence representation, redress, and justice. Next slide, please. Racial literacy is relational, it is identity, it is intersectional. Relationships are at the core of racial literacy. It is about our relationships with one another. In this work of learning and unlearning, excavating our proximity to racism, mistakes will be made. Let us not absent ourselves from this work when it gets hard. It will get hard. Our commitment to dialogue allows us to name and heal relational injuries. Let's do better because now we know that we can. Identity. Who do we say we are? Are we who we say we are? How do we know? And how do we show that we care? It is about accountability, showing up, being transparent, and honoring the now. The now. Racial literacy is intersectional, acknowledges our multiple identities, positions, and impacts of oppression. We are more similar than we are different. We bring our histories, our narratives, our memories, our ancestors, our origin stories, our childhood experiences. We bring our hope, we bring our bravery. Next slide, please. Racial literacy is global citizenship, and global citizenship relies on racial literacy. We can do this glorious work, and we can do it together. I would like to thank Dean Pfleger for using her power to make this event happen. I would like to thank Dr. Ellen Cushman, my pop-up co-instructor, for bringing her scholarship, her voice, her wisdom, and her humanity to this racial literacy work. It is a joy and honor to share space with you both. And I want to thank my sister friend, Alyssa Walker, for her honest critique of and technical help with my slides. Dr. Brunson is next.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson-Wood, and thank you for everybody who made time to join us today. I am the Thomas P. ONeill Professor of Public Life in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and the Department of Political Science at Northeastern University. I'm also the Director of Graduate Mentoring and Diversity Initiatives in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. I've examined Black youth's experiences with the police for the past 2 decades. However, I've lived as a Black man in this sometimes racially inhospitable society for much longer, meaning that similar to many other Black folks, I too have endured racist affronts and indignities. Therefore, my unwavering commitment to promoting racial literacy is both personal and professional. Professionally, I want to help others make sense of scholarship that consistently demonstrates Black people's mistreatment at the hands of police, but also strengthen my own resolve concerning combating racist affronts. Growing up in a hardscrabble Midwestern city, I had mixed opinions of the police. The vast majority of my favorable perceptions occurred as a young child. For example, police regularly visited my elementary school as part of the Officer Friendly program. This initiative focused on improved public safety awareness, and it emphasized that police officers were residents' buddies and protectors. And during one particular school visit, I remember an officer delivered a particularly memorable lecture on pedestrian safety using miniature traffic signals to demonstrate how students might carefully cross busy intersections. Interestingly, I do not remember seeing any traffic lights in my immediate neighborhood. Nonetheless, my classmates and I look forward to the officer-friendly assemblies and likewise the popular coloring books that we received afterwards. I also recall exchanging greetings with and playfully trailing behind officers who worked foot patrol in my neighborhood as part of a community safety program. I was particularly fascinated by the policemen who could skillfully twirl nightsticks and whistle as they walked through the neighborhood. It was not until later, however, that I comprehended that the baton's true function in police work was something less than something to be fascinated by. Similar to other neighborhoods, mine enjoyed a full complement of colorful characters. My immediate neighbors were a large family of about 10 teenagers who were very well known to the police. And it appeared that whenever police officers showed up on their doorstep, it was a precinct clearing event. That is, the family often physically fought with the police, and despite always finding themselves on the receiving end of these bloody clashes, they were seemingly unafraid. Both the girls and the boys were especially tough. Further, several of my relatives and childhood friends frequently shared with me, usually in graphic detail, their negative police encounters. For example, my closest friend's older brother's skull was fractured by police, and once joyful and very outgoing, he never seemed quite the same following that incident. And I quickly came to understand that otherwise decent people could easily find themselves on the business end of a policeman's nightstick. I also have my own collection of direct experiences of being racially profiled by the police. Most of my negative experiences occurred during my formative years. I recall officers illegally searching a friend's car as we prepared to leave a popular roller skating rink, then issuing him several summonses for various equipment and moving violations, despite the fact that we were parked. And as was typical, the officer behaved very aggressively toward our carload of young Black males, repeatedly threatening bodily harm and arrest on manufactured charges. As I grew older and larger, officers became increasingly verbally abusive, physically intrusive, and overall menacing. I also began to receive much more frequent reports from friends and family members regarding harms that they had suffered at the hands of police. And while the vast majority of these unwelcome encounters did not result in serious physical injury, loved ones often described emotional trauma stemming from routine police and very public humiliation. And these accounts involved Black people being strip searched and forced to lie on the pavement with their bodies in automobiles being unlawfully searched. As it relates to professionally, my graduate school experience was particularly instrumental in helping to refine what would later to be my research interest. For example, I began doing field work initially focused on understanding how young Black people living in a South Side high crime Chicago neighborhood navigated the challenging gang terrain. And following a particularly rich interview with one young person, that person just sternly explained to me that gang members were often their siblings, their extended family members and friends, and implored me to use my research to do something about the police, who for them posed greater safety risks than did youth gangs. That pivotal moment reminded me of how detrimental aggressive policing had been to many of my neighbors and family members growing up. And I would later explore these issues extensively over the span of my academic career. In fact, one of my professors who served on my dissertation committee prudently advised me to pursue research topics that have long shelf lives. And unfortunately, given the recent global unrest following the string of police killings of Black people, my graduate school's advice about pursuing research that has longevity has proven incredibly astute. In particular, racism is deeply and structurally embedded in American culture and policing. So it is against this backdrop that we need more nuanced dialogue and analysis of Black people's experiences with the police, one that humanizes both parties. And that's a dimension that's sorely missing from most current discussions of fragile police-minority community relations. Thank you for your attention. Now I turn over to you, Dr. Bemis.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Brunson. Keshi, everyone. Hello. My name is Kylie Ariel Bemis, and I teach in the Khoury College of Computer Sciences in the Masters for Data Science program. In my free time, I also enjoy writing fiction and poetry, and I am an enrolled member of the Zuni tribe. Zuni is a pueblo in New Mexico, and for those of you who might know what this is, my blood quantum is 1/2. What that means is that my mother was full-blooded and my father is white. Blood quantum is a thing in many of our tribes that kind of defines citizenship, tribal citizenship. And so growing up, I always often kind of thought of myself as half, because I was half Zuni, and only recently I've really been able to think of myself as fully Zuni. But as I was growing up, I grew up primarily in Indiana, far away from our reservation in New Mexico, because that's where my father worked. My parents moved there when I was before I was born, and so I grew up in a fairly privileged childhood. But every summer, I would go back to the reservation in New Mexico with my mother, and I would spend time with all of my cousins, my aunts and uncles. I have many cousins, many aunts and uncles. My mother was one of 12 siblings. And so I always knew firsthand and very strongly what a difference it was going between my privileged lifestyle in suburbia back to the reservation. And I always felt I was growing up in kind of two worlds. And so that's something that I've had to kind of try to balance and live with my whole life. My tribe is lucky enough or fortunate enough that we haven't completely lost all of our traditions. And so we're still able to practice a lot of our traditional religious dances that haven't been lost yet. The kivas, the dancing groups that put these on are initiate people into these dancing groups when they're young boys. And so I forgot to mention at the beginning that I use she, her pronouns, but I was initiated into one of the dancing groups as a young boy when I was 12 years old, I think. And so as I got older in college, in graduate school, I realized I no longer identified that way, and I needed to transition to female. And as I was coming to that understanding, one of the things that I kept coming back to in most tribes, in many Native American societies, you've probably heard of the term two-spirit. And in my own tribe, Zuni, we have a concept called thamana, which is our own concept of two-spirit. And I found a book about a two-spirit Zuni woman named Wetwa. And so I looked up to her a lot, and I read everything that I could about her, and she was kind of an inspiration to me as I transitioned and came to learn who I am as a Zuni woman. But unfortunately, that's one of the aspects of our culture that kind of has been erased or lost, is that the two-spirit tradition, our Thamana tradition, is our elders are no longer really aware of it anymore. Some of my younger cousins and aunts and uncles were more accepting when I came out as transgender. But some of my elders, some of my older aunts and uncles and my mother were less supportive, because in their current understanding that wasn't the Zuni way, even though traditionally it had been. And so I think that was when I felt most this loss of culture, that there used to be a place in our society for me and other people like me. There used to be a path set out for how to transition and cross between different genders and different gender roles. And I feel like I was denied that by colonialism, by the enforcement of Western binary genders onto our culture. And so that's something that I feel very viscerally, that I know that this history exists, and I know that there used to be a place for me and people like me, but it's hard for me to bring that back, especially when I feel, or have already felt like so much of an outsider. As someone who's been living in two worlds, it's just very difficult. And so that's something that I struggle with all the time. And one of my happiest memories when I went back recently, my grandmother, my hota in Zuni, doesn't speak very much English anymore. And she didn't recognize me at first. And she kept asking, "Where is so-and-so?" using my old name. And I tried to introduce myself to her again. And one of my aunts, who was more supportive, tried to explain to her in Zuni that it's me, and that she used the term like Wetwa, famous Zuni Two-Spirit. And so that was the way that I was able to connect and kind of meet my grandmother again. And I know if I go back again, I'll probably have to meet her again and she might not remember me again, but that's something that gives me hope. And as I go forward, that's still something I'm still trying to reconcile and find my place in the Zuni world as a Two-Spirit person, as in Western society as a transgender woman. And I remember I went to a protest on bathroom bills a couple of years ago, and I had a sign that I made with another Two-Spirit friend of mine, and it said, Columbus made me trans. And I had to explain it to some of the other white trans people there, that what that meant was that because of Columbus, because of colonialism and the Spanish and then the Americans, that has taken away the place that used to be for people like myself. And that is why now I identify as in the Western system as a trans woman, where else before I might have identified as Tlamana, like Wewa. So these are some things that I consider every day in my day-to-day life and I'm constantly struggling with. Thank you for giving me this time to share that with you. And so now I'd like to turn the virtual mic over to Dr. Patricia Davis.
Sorry about that. Thank you, everybody, and for this opportunity to participate in such a tremendous undertaking. My name is Patricia Davis, and I'm an associate professor in the Communication Studies Department at Northeastern. My interests lie in the influence of history and historical representation in the construction and articulation of racial identity, which includes the ways in which historical narratives are mobilized to resist racial stereotypes and foster racial literacy. I developed my interest in history through a number of experiences that began in childhood and continued well into adulthood. I grew up in the South, specifically in Virginia, and have spent most of my life in that region of the country, most recently in Atlanta. Although biased historical narratives pervade the entire country and the world for that matter, this is arguably most explicit in the South, where more than 100 years of historical propaganda spread through film, history textbooks, monuments, and other media have managed, among other things, to turn slavery into an institution that was beneficial for Black people, Confederate generals and soldiers into honorable men who were fighting not to preserve slavery, but rather for the love of hearth and home, and lynching into an extrajudicial, yet understandable, punishment for violent crimes committed by Black people. These lies have performed important cultural work in terms of preserving racial hierarchies in the entire country into the present. One of the most memorable moments for me was when I went to college and returned home on break and happened to take a look at my younger sister's high school history textbook and was appalled at what I happened to read. The section on slavery and its aftermath painted a picture in which the white people of the South had been victimized by the Civil War and Reconstruction. There was no mention of the trauma that Black people experienced as a result of slavery and war, nor the ways in which this era of history ensured that Black people remain marginalized to this day. And of course, textbooks in and of themselves are very influential modes of propagating particular historical narratives. Later, while living in Atlanta and applying to graduate school, I paid close attention to the controversy surrounding the public display of the Confederate battle flag, which at the time was part of Georgia's state flag. I was interested in the ways in which the dominant white interpretation of Civil War history seemed to pervade the political discussions, while the Black perspective was marginalized. Through these experiences and others, the seeds were planted for a future career of investigating the ways in which history is represented in the public sphere, both inside and outside of the US, and that includes Boston. Given our contemporary moment, knowledge of the ways in which the past impacts the present is more important than ever. I look forward to our session next week on history. And with that said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Uta Poiger.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. You can probably hear from my accent that I was born and raised in Germany. Indeed, I lived there for the first 22 years of my life and then came to the United States for 1 year of study abroad. That 1 year has now turned into over 30 years in this country and into an immigrant story, also a story of intellectual and professional back and forth. I'm a historian, a cultural historian, who has been deeply influenced by studying US history and cultures, and especially by folks who have challenged dominant narratives. I have studied Germany through the lenses of Americanization and globalization, and have made the study of gender and racial formations central to my scholarly work. For example, I have looked at conceptions of masculinity and how they have influenced the reception of American imports such as jazz in Germany. My path is also one where I have learned that not thinking of oneself as a subject of racialization is a way of thinking that comes from privilege. I grew up in a small town in the most northern part of Germany. I never thought of myself as white. In fact, that term wasn't in the vocabulary around me. My hometown was hundreds of miles from the parts of West Germany where American troops were stationed, which meant that Germans in those regions were living close to Americans, including white and Black Americans. But I don't recall ever thinking about that until I was a teenager. The few Black people I would have seen as a child in the streets of larger cities in northern Germany would likely have been university students from countries in Africa. I also never thought much of the fact that even as a child in a small town, I was living in the middle of a history of migration, actually one of forced migration. My parents, who as school teachers had some social capital, but not as much as the farmers and business people of the town, were conscious of who was a refugee and who had deeper roots in the region. And really, almost all their friends were like them, refugees from state socialism. But for the most part, refugees referred to people whom we today would call expellees, rather than refugees. Expellees are ethnic Germans who had left or had to leave lands of Eastern and Central Europe at the end of World War II. I didn't learn formally in school about World War II or about the history of the Nazis and the Third Reich until 7th or 8th grade. However, in everyday life, I regularly heard stories about National Socialism and World War II and its aftermath, as well as the Cold War. The one history lesson that I remember from my elementary school happened in 3rd grade. My teacher taught us about the segregation of Black and white people in the United States and Martin Luther King's fight against that segregation. I remember my utter shock at learning that Black people were not allowed to use the same bathrooms as whites, or go to the same schools, or stay in the same hotels. My teacher was full of admiration for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and I remember her showing us pictures of a march he led and her telling us about Martin Luther King's assassination, which would have happened about 5 years before these lessons. I don't remember whether my teacher told us about the civil rights movement as a multiracial movement or about differences between North and South. These lessons did not address the full cruelty of Jim Crow, nor the multifaceted movements for Black liberation that existed. And I can't really blame my 3rd grade teacher for that. Decades later, I asked questions about what my teacher did. What motivated my teacher, who was born in the late 19-teens, to give her 3rd graders this lesson in Germany? Why did she not tell us at the same time about the 1935 Nuremberg laws and the history of segregation and genocide in Germany than a mere 30 to 40 years in the past. The Nuremberg laws codified the segregation of the roughly 600,000 German Jews from what one might call ethnic Germans, and they were one step on the path to the murder of 6 million European Jews amidst the violence of World War II, violence perpetrated by Germans, Nazis, and others who helped them. My third grade teacher's lessons definitely made me see the United States as a country shaped by racism and as one where Black people stood up forcefully to injustice. I want to tell you one more anecdote. After I came to the United States, I for the first time had the opportunity to study with and become friends with people who identified as Jews. In typical fashion, travel and study abroad made me much more conscious of being German. I reacted to that by trying out what I can now label a posture of philo-Semitism. I stressed when interacting with friends, Jewish or not, the great cultural intertwining of Jews and non-Jews in Central Europe and my great affinity to Jewish culture. Until one night at a casual dinner with students and professors, one of my professors, herself a Jewish immigrant to the United States from Hungary, quietly said to me in front of 6 or 8 people at the table that likely many Jewish people would not reciprocate my thinking. In fact, many would see what I was doing as offensive. Talk about affect. I felt deeply embarrassed. My professor had taught me a powerful lesson outside of the classroom. A powerful lesson about a position of privilege, privilege that might be mixed with guilt, a position of privilege and guilt that might lead one to pronounce affinities, affinities that in turn obscure histories of racism. It has also been a powerful lesson about universalizing moves, the celebration that we are all the same, a universalizing move that well-meaning white people and people of privilege make regularly. These pronouncements can be meant to counter racism, but they can also, and in the very same move, obscure histories and realities of racism. Racism in the broader structures that surround us, as well as in our more immediate surroundings, our city, our university, our personal environments. Let me end by saying that to move us forward, we need innovative policies, social movements, and difficult conversations. Building collaboration and trust across differences requires constant work. And I remain hopeful that this time of uncertainty and reckoning is also a great opportunity for connection and for working for systemic change. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Lee.
All right, so hi everybody. This is Matt Lee, Dr. Matt Lee. I'm a professor in human services in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. I teach courses at Northeastern in counseling, race and empowerment, and ethnic identity and conflict. And I want to say thank you to everybody posting in the chat so far, especially the folks giving us a shout out on accessibility. Please feel free to communicate with me during my presentation with a thumbs up or a +1. This is how I usually like to go back and forth with the audience. I'm sorry I can't see you right now. But let me tell you a little bit about my story. Back in the day when I was in college, I was a double major, in fact, studying psychology and English. And the stories I was reading about the human condition, my interest in race and double consciousness, I was really fortunate to take the classes that I wanted. But I wasn't that active yet as a sophomore. But one of my best friends was also a lit major. She and I used to discuss racism and colorism, not feeling ethnic enough in some spaces, but also feeling like the sole representative for our race in other situations. She was an Afro-Boricua Puerto Rican student with dreadlocks and white skin and freckles. So she stood out. During my sophomore year in college, she invited me to a talk that was critical in my development as a race-conscious scholar. And the talk was given by a famous philosopher, author, and professor named Cornel West. And he's still alive now. He's still giving talks. Now, at the time, as a college student, my interest in psychology was to become a therapist and do individual work with clients, especially Asian American clients. I thought the best way to end racism was individual acts of behavior and individuals stepping up and taking on positions of leadership. Like if you just worked hard, you can make it and you could represent. But Dr. West, in his speech, it was the first time I ever heard of the concept of institutional racism. I'm not sure any of my other professors had ever brought it up, but institutional racism was what made it difficult for BIPOC folks to enter positions of leadership and represent. People, not all of us are able to start out on the same level playing field that many of my grade school and high school teachers purported there to be. And so looking back now, I thought about this a lot today, actually. I took several classes in Black literature, and all of my Black literature professors had indicated institutional racism is real, but they just used different language to talk about it than a sociologist or a psychologist would talk about it. They would mention terms like othering and allegory and metaphor, and these were our tools to try to understand how racism was impacting the lives of the main characters of the texts that we were reading. So simultaneously, my psychology classes were giving me terminology to talk about social cognition, which is how we see and perceive one another, how we interpret one another. So it has a lot to do with stereotypes and affect, but also how our thoughts can inspire and perhaps change our actions. So I sat there during this talk with Dr. West, and it really left an imprint on me, because the way that he spoke about racism and white supremacy, he was trying to rally everyone there to participate in dismantling racism. He spoke in a way that said anyone from any race and from any major can step up and start that conversation with somebody else, maybe become a friend with somebody else, to see and acknowledge the differences and value them. And those steps are all a part of how we get to dismantle long-held institutional practices. We have to name it, and we have to find our allies who can help us name it, and we'll act for the righteous good and the most meaningful justice that we can. So my call to you, those of you who are here and engage in this endeavor to gain some skills in racial literacy, don't let this end with just you. Keep talking about this work with others, share it, talk about it with your other faculty, with your family, your friends, and keep it going. I feel very lucky as part of my scholarship and in my role as a professor here, we get to talk about diversity and dialogue and our intersectional experiences of privilege and oppression, and to illuminate the fact that it's more than just individual acts. There is a collective, because there are systems behind the scenes that are guiding everything. And yes, I know the work can be difficult, but since when is equity a given? Since when can a person be innocently shot while sleeping? And who's still left to shout for justice? So for many of us, equity is not a given. And we recognize that it is not a given for others. And we have to fight for it. And we have to work to create the world that we want to live in. And taking these steps, having these conversations is part of that work. My hope is that you can find some genuine relationships and connections from your time in this program and at Northeastern, and of course, in the rest of your lives, and try to build a world that is more just for everyone. That's my time. Thanks again for everybody who put this together and invited me to share some thoughts about this project. And I'll be turning it next to my great colleague, Dr. Aljo.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lee, and thanks everyone for attending and for sticking it out with us for so long. I will try to keep my responses and my remarks relatively short while attending to the prompt that I was given. So my name is Nicole Aljo, and I am Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies. I also co-direct the Early Caribbean Digital Archive, which is an interactive scholarly digital database focused on texts from and about the Caribbean prior to the 20th century. This work in digital archives comes out of my scholarship that examines the literary productions by and about Black people during the long 18th century, roughly between 1688 and 1837. And I have a particular focus on the Caribbean area and the intersections of the slave narrative and the early novel, which come into being at the same time. My scholarship contributes to contemporary anti-racist efforts by highlighting the myriad ways in which Black lives mattered in the 18th century. And I also engage with these archival texts by drawing on the insights of contemporary post-colonial and Black feminist theories. I'm currently wrapping up a book manuscript that draws on theories of Black digital practice archival decolonization in order to analyze a group of representations of enslaved Afro-Caribbean women. Traditional knowledge often construes Black voices as silent or absent in the archives. In fact, there are many different kinds of Black voices in the archives. The problem has been that those voices have been overlooked and marginalized by historians, right, by librarians, by archivists, et cetera. And so I am invested in bringing these voices up to so that we can see that there is actually a very long history, right, of Black voices in the archives. It's not, right, something that just happened after the Civil War or, you know, after World War II, which there are people who actually think that. In terms of my classes, I offer classes in early African American literature. I also offer classes on race and gender in the 18th century British literature, and I also offer classes on contemporary post-colonial studies, so contemporary world lit. Since I will be leading the discussion on the relationships between racial literacy and culture, I thought I would focus my response in that vein. So to begin, I was born in Jamaica and emigrated to Connecticut with my parents when I was 2. And so like Kylie, I share a bicultural kind of background. So I grew up going back and forth between both places. We initially, when we first arrived in the States, we initially lived in a racially mixed suburb. It was close to Hartford because Hartford had a sizable Caribbean immigrant community. And as I said, I would go right back and forth. My parents were former teachers in Jamaica. They did not teach here because they weren't allowed to, right? The degrees, their experiences that they had in the Caribbean were thought not to be effective in the United States. So they both worked at different jobs, but they still were teachers. And so they were very invested in you know, teaching, my sisters and I. And so like Tracy, I was taught that I would, as a young Black woman, would have to work much harder than anyone else. But I also learned from them the diversity of the African diaspora and just the diversity of the globe. My parents had friends not only from Jamaica, but also from the other Anglophone Caribbean islands. They had friends from Cuba, from Puerto Rico. They had friends from Nigeria, China, and India. So grew up in this really lovely multicultural kind of context. Things changed when my mother was offered a new job and my family moved to the suburbs of New York City. And we moved to a predominantly white suburb in north of New York City. And it was here in this context that I experienced explicit racism for the first time. The first night we spent in our house, my father had to chase away a group of white teenage boys who had gathered together some wood to try to burn a cross on our lawn. So that was our welcome to the neighborhood. In my school, there was a very small number of Black students, and I was usually the only Black student, usually the only Black girl in my classes. At some point in 9th grade, it was probably February, my English teacher, who was a white young man who'd gotten an MA from Berkeley, which he told us over and over again to kind of offer evidence of his radical bona fides, right? So he announced that for the first time, we were going to be allowed to read a text by a Black author. And I was incredibly excited. The text was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And I'd read Black writers on my own, growing up. And so here, was an opportunity, for me to show, my expertise. There was that, but it was also, an opportunity to look at Black literature seriously, right, alongside the Shakespeare, right, and the J.D. Salinger that we were reading. So super excited. On the first day, the teacher breathlessly stated how we were finally going to get to read this important novel from the Black perspective. That finally we were going to get to learn about the Black experience, and that Janie's journey, Janie's the main character in Their Eyes Are Watching God, that her journey throughout the novel is one that speaks to all Black women. He talked also about how we were finally going to get to learn about the authentic backgrounds of the Black folks who had come north during the Great Migration. So I'm sitting there experiencing so many feelings, right? As a young, ninth grade student, the only Black girl in my class. And primary among them was confusion. Because this did not reflect my experience, right? Growing up in Jamaica, going back and forth, meeting people from Cuba, Puerto Rico, et cetera, right? Meeting Black folks from Germany, right? All sorts of places. And here was this English teacher basically telling me that my experience was not authentic, was not Black. And so, from being very excited to talk about this text, it went from, I just sat there silent, because I went from the hypervisibility, right, of being the only Black student in this class, to the complete invisibility of having my experience, right, as a Jamaican American, just completely erased by this teacher. So when I went home and I later shared that incident with my parents, they told me basically, and I remember being very surprised with this advice. They told me to ignore him, right? So these are two teachers telling me to ignore another teacher, and because he had no idea what he was talking about. And so, right, and my father in particular told me to remember where I was from and how I was raised, and that I should be secure in that knowledge and to completely ignore what he called the nonsense that I would get. And then he shared with me that this is something that would probably happen again, and that this was a good experience for me to get this here now, right, where they could explain to me the situation. And yeah, so this was a defining experience, right, where it highlighted for me, first of all, the flatness, right, of stereotypes, right, where you hear that stereotypes are flat, but when you're actually presented with them, it's quite another thing, right? So it concretized, right, the flatness of stereotypes, but it also concretized for me the importance of culture, right, and the diversity of culture. That here was this guy who was lovely otherwise, right, he was in the right thinking the right things, right? He wanted to present this diverse story, gave us all of this, hands-on material, all of that. But because he presented it to us, or at least to me, right, in a very myopic kind of way, consequently, it made that, so my first encounter with this novel was problematic, right? And it was not until, it took years for me to go back to that novel. Obviously as an English professor, right, I was a reader, loved reading, loved school, loved English class in particular. But I can tell you that most of the experience of my ninth grade English class has been blocked out. I don't remember what we read other than their eyes were watching God. I don't remember really anything else from that class, because it was so overshadowed by this experience of my teacher not understanding me, and this fact that the culture that I knew as being this very diverse, vibrant culture was being presented basically in a very singular, very narrow kind of fashion. So just to wrap up here, I just want to say, to reiterate some of the things that folks have been saying all along. So wonderful that you all have signed up for this class, to be willing to put in the time and energy and effort, because it is difficult, but it is incredibly important, right? I mean, I really wonder what my life would have been like, if I had maybe a teacher of color, or maybe somebody who was, a little more open-minded. Maybe I would have found my way into, literary studies a little earlier than I have. And I will turn things over to Dr. Robinson Wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aljo, and thank you everyone for your wonderful your comments, your stories, your narratives. Thank you so very much. I just want to apologize to people who have been having difficulty with hearing and being able to hear the the interpreters and to understand what the interpreters are saying. We want our deaf community members to know that we are so glad you're here, and we know that you depend on the interpreters and you haven't been able to see them. And so you've asked for a way in which you can have access to this material. So it seems very clear that uploading Zoom 5.3 makes all the difference. It doesn't take very long. So I just want to apologize to you and let you know that that seems to work, but we will certainly attend to these issues so that the experience that we have the next time will be much more improved, because we value your presence and we want it to be meaningful for you. So we get a chance to have some questions and answers, interact with one another on the panel. Just want to again say thank you, everyone. So I have a question, and then I know that there are some questions as well. I wonder, and this is to the panelists in general, what might we do to encourage racial literacy for people, colleagues, staff, students who question the relevance or the urgency of this work? It's a broad question, I understand.
Tracy, I try and take a stab at it. This is Uta Poiger, Dr. Robinson Wood. I take a stab at it. And I hope that more of our colleagues are going to chime in, but that perhaps also some of the audience members will give advice in the chat on these matters. Again, I'm really grateful to everybody for being here and for elucidating what combining, as one of you said, the personal and the broader systemic, what Dr. Robinson Wood has also talked about as the psychosocial, so the personal and the social, the personal and the political, to use an old moniker that often is associated with feminism, but of course much more broadly applicable as well. And at the same time, I think we sometimes wonder whether the people who would perhaps profit most from having engagement in difficult conversations are actually not joining us at such moments. And I think also I think one of the very exciting and important things that I see happening for the first time in this country is that I see many more white people talking about having a responsibility for participating in such conversations, but also not laying claim to having the leadership in those conversations. And I have to say that gives me hope. At the same time, I will also just say to all of you in the audience, like my co-speakers, I want to encourage you to come to the subsequent sessions as well, because I do think what we really are stressing with our different stories is that there's a lot that is personal about this. And as so many of us have said as well, there is a lot that is systemic. And I think the following sessions will also give us, again, a way of thinking about what the systemic is that we need to be working at as well. And so I think, you know, as a historian, I of course think that context matters hugely, but I think we all also recognize that we have to adapt, and we will do this work differently in different contexts. And at the same time, that talking about identity, talking about racism is not easy. And again, we hope that you see the ways in which we have told our stories as a way in which you can perhaps also tell some of your stories, but also elicit stories from others that do allow us connections that won't be simple. Anyway, I've gone on for too long. I hope that my fellow panelists will have other ideas.
Do any other members of the panel have a response to the question? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I mean, my initial reaction is like, can you look outside right now? Can you open the newspaper, turn on TV? Like, stuff has been going on, and not just the past 4 years, but for a very long time. And so a message that I have to my students in particular is that you can apply racial literacy to pretty much any field that's out there. I teach a lot of psychology and human services students, and they know I need to be culturally competent to be able to diagnose, treat, and understand anybody of any cultural background, and that includes understanding some of the policies that can lead to individual choices and behaviors. That includes understanding the historical processes that have led to why certain things are the way they are. On the human level, if we just want to understand the emotions that our neighbors and coworkers are experiencing when nationwide tragedies happen, and you see like some people not care at all, and you see some communities really struggle. I mean, literally, if you want to study even meteorology, and wildfires, there's a racial element there. What particular communities are going to be hurt worse, and which ones are going to be more likely to be hired back after the recession is over. And so this racial literacy is kind of like needed in pretty much every field. I'm pleased that this exists, and I'm also pleased there's a lot of new research coming out now, being published by psychologists and education psychologists, showing that if you start you can start lessons on racial literacy, even in grade school and middle school, and it can lead to increases in empathy and really understanding cultural differences in a way that is meant to, in my mind, be part of a democracy where people actually see and hear and can understand one another. So I think racial literacy is really critical for everybody to know, to learn, and to also understand it's an evolving process, right? Like you're going to be doing this for a few weeks, a few months, but you can keep going. You know, all of us up here who are professors, we're still researching, we're still studying, we're still turning on the news so we can be up to date with our practices. And I think this is just essential to functioning in a multiracial society. So that's my short answer to your question. I hope that helps.
Matt, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Uta, so much. Anybody else want to respond? Okay, there was a question, and I'll just read it. Speaking on identity, what makes it all right for us to call out a suspected false identity / how does this happen and become an accepted opinion, critique of one's identity? So I'll read it again. Speaking on identity, what makes it all right for us to call out a suspected false identity? How does this happen and become an accepted opinion / critique of one's identity?
Who wants to take it?
I think that's something I can at least try to answer a little bit. Identity is very difficult, and I think I have at least a couple of different perspectives on false identity and when to call that out and when you can't call that out. On the one hand, I think as a trans person, and especially as a two-spirit person, I think two-spirit is a term that sometimes gets claimed by people who maybe shouldn't claim it. I think that's something that's especially common with Native American terms in general, and there tends to be a lot of cultural appropriation across the board. But I think two-spirit is definitely something that I've seen sometimes white trans people claim and say that they identify as, when without really understanding that two-spirit is a collection of many different cultural specific genders across hundreds of different tribes, many of which can be very different from each other. And so when I say I'm two-spirit, I mean specifically Femina, or at least my tribe's interpretation of it. And so I think before calling out an identity, think about what place you have to be able to call that out. Is that something that you identify as? If it's, as a two-spirit person, I certainly feel much more comfortable saying, if you're not Native American, if you're not Native or Indigenous in some way, you probably shouldn't use claim the term two-spirit. And as far as times when people sometimes call out identities as false without it really being okay, I think that's also something that happens. Certainly as a person who's biracial, who has half blood quantum, I have agonized over when it's okay and when it's not okay to identify myself as just Zuni. Am I Native? Am I not Native? Especially since I didn't grow up on the reservation except during the summers and those school breaks that I was able to go home. And so that's something that's also very complicated. And I think that's something that we kind of have to each answer for ourselves, but I've become very comfortable claiming my identity as Zuni, as fully Native American, regardless of what it says on my tribal citizenship card, blood quantum wise. And I think that kind of thing is something that's often used to divide us. Blood quantum was certainly designed that way originally, so that the idea being as we mix marriages, eventually none of us will be Native enough to be Native anymore. And certainly the opposite was kind of done in the Black community with the one drop rule and things like that. So it's very complicated, and I think you always have to consider, how do you relate to the identity that you're considering false or considering calling out as false, and what place or what right do you have to kind of critique that identity? Because there are some identities that I feel comfortable critiquing, and many that I would not critique myself, but would certainly listen to other people who share that identity critique them.
Thank you, Dr. Bemis. I loved listening to you, and I appreciate the clarity of your thoughts. I find myself thinking about two things. I find myself thinking about cultural humility in terms of what does it mean to stand down or to ask for permission from a group to enter into spaces or into places. And I think a part of privilege is that you don't necessarily think you have to do that, that you just can go where you want to go and name what you want to name and do what you want to do, you know, because you can move like that. And so sometimes I think it's just important to defer to people who might be in a position to offer some wisdom about, you know, who gets to declare something as an accurate representation or not, and how does that feel to the people? And then the appropriation in terms of how sometimes with cultural theft, there's a sense you can just kind of decide what to take and claim from spaces and places where perhaps you have not earned the right to be, or join with people, as opposed to this kind of sense of thievery. So there was another question. What are the thoughts of professors of color on racial literacy? So what are the thoughts of professors of color on racial literacy? At first, I thought the question was, what are the professors' thoughts about color and racial literacy? But I think they're asking, what are the professors who identify as people of color on racial literacy? Is that what you're thinking, Matt? Because I see you shaking your head. Is that what you're?
Yeah, but I've spoken already. I don't want to like open up the floor to other voices.
I thought that, well, I think that's what we've been talking about all night. All of us, irrespective of how we identify. My first thought was that it had to do with color, and then I thought maybe the question was related to colorism. But I loved what our provost said at the very beginning, and I also loved what Dr. Lee said. And what Dr. Lee said was, from his interaction with Dr. Cornell West, was that, you know, it doesn't matter what your major is, and it doesn't matter, you know, your race, that this is work for all of us as people, you know. And so sometimes with racial segregation, there's a sense of, well, that work is for those people, those visible people of color. And those of us who don't have the melanin content can absent ourselves because we're not legitimate or real people of color. And so I think there's this time for us all, irrespective of our hue, to know that this is an effort of humanity. And so all of us can step up and step in. And I think that's the magic of this work, because it does bring us all together in terms of we are more similar as people than we are different. I don't want to minimize the differences, but I think we make too much of them in this world that spends too much time on racism. Dr. Lee.
Yeah, I will add one more thing, which is the effort put forth here, I think is great, that students and faculty involved have decided to do this now in an election year with COVID going on. But if this leads to individual departments and colleges saying, let's make this central to our curriculum in terms of what we teach and also who is teaching this could be the start of something that's really driven by what students are seeing now. And I see this a lot in my classes. Gen Z is memeing the hell out of this and is making us older people really aware that they know what's going on. They've seen what's going on for 5-10 years. And want to see change. So this is part of it, showing up to this and continuing the work after this, replicating this, getting your friends involved in this. This is all part of how this movement is not just a one-time moment that you're in for the 5-6 weeks. Like, this work can continue. So I would love to see more participation from more departments and more faculty becoming facile in this, and departments saying, yeah, let's make this become central to our curriculum, because this is how we be the change.
So much, Dr. Lee. Were there other comments from any of our panelists?
Yeah, Tracy, this is Nicole. I just wanted to add that there's a similar perspective in terms of Africana studies, right? That very often Africana studies, ethnic studies, right? Gender studies, sexuality studies, folks think that you have to be that thing in order to, right, engage in study of that. And that's not the case at all, right? These are, right, in addition to a lived experience, right? So, right, I am a Black woman, right? You can't tell that I'm Jamaican, right, from looking at me, although my parents might disagree, but right, but generally, right, you can't really tell. And so, right, no one else is going to. But if you know, right, that there is a diversity, right, of the African diaspora, and you have that racial literacy, right, that you know that the Black community is diverse, then you are less likely, right, to engage in the kind of stereotypical stereotyping activity that my teacher engaged in. You'll be hopefully, right, a little more open-minded and a little more willing to, embrace the, great diversity that we have across the globe. So yeah, I mean, I think racial literacy is crucial, is vital to our existence on this planet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aljo. There's a question for you. How did you come back to reading Their Eyes Were Watching God? I had a similar experience reading Iron and Silk as the only Asian American woman during my freshman year of high school.
So the person who brought me back to Their Eyes Were Watching God was an elderly Southern white lady professor that I had at the University of Vermont. That's where I did my master's degree. She basically, I don't want to say sat me down, but we had a conversation where where she was expressing how she had come to to study basically a text by Black women, and it was hearing her express her difficulty and the thoughtfulness and the way that she still persisted basically after being basically convinced that she should not study this. That's what allowed me to see that, well, even though there was this, this is difficult for me, right? If she, right, with all of her baggage, right, as a white Southern woman, could come to this text, then I certainly should be able to, right, overlook what that nitwit said from 9th grade.
Lovely, thank you so much. I just wanted to know if we could hear from Dr. Davis and Dr. Brunson, any comments that you would like to make, or questions from us as fellow panelists?
Well, I just wanted to very quickly put an exclamation point behind what Drs. Lee and Aljo said about the importance of racial literacy, and also to put out a call for everyone here to pay it forward. Not only is it important for you to become racially literate, but also it's important for you to do the work of enabling others in your circle to become racially literate as well. And that includes your parents, grandparents, cousins, and friends, those who are not fortunate enough to get training in racial literacy, because there's tons of research out there that demonstrates that racial attitudes are changed most effectively at the interpersonal level. So you have the power to influence others in terms of developing a sense of racial literacy as well, not just for yourself, but also for others.
Mm. So beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Davis. I really appreciate that. That is so powerful. Dr. Brunson, want to just make sure your voice is central to what we're saying.
I appreciate that. I just want to not only reinforce the comments that my fellow panelists have made, but also kind of bring us back to the early introductory comments about this moment in time and how this moment in time can feel like many things at the same time. And so I would say for many of us who have, done this work and have our own lived experiences, that this moment in time can feel both exhausting, but also hopeful and optimistic. And again, I would also encourage those who are willing and to be brave and to engage in these conversations and sharpen their skills, myself included. There's a benefit to us in terms of how we live our lives of other people around us, or become more competent in their racial literacy. Makes life more, I guess, enjoyable for everyone, and that it is a responsibility that we all have to increase the racial literacy of people in our society. And I really like the comment about, friends and family, influencing other people and helping them to increase their competencies as well. So thank you for allowing me to speak on it.
Thank you, Dr. Brunson. Just any more comments? I just want to make sure that if anybody else would like to say something before we close, the floor is yours. Just what a pleasure this has been, the highlight of my time. And I just thank you for being such lovely colleagues. So thank you to our audience for being here. And the recording of this event will be available on the CSSH YouTube channel and Facebook page. Dr. Davis, our own Dr. Davis, will be with us on the 29th, so next week, and she will begin at 5 o'clock. And so we're very happy to have her speak about history, racial literacy and history. So thank you again for being here, and we wish you a very, very good night. Bye-bye.